Hello, my name is Linda Jones, and I'm here to tell you the most important story of my life. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day in New York City. I was sitting in a bustling upscale café, surrounded by the aroma of fresh coffee and the soft murmur of conversations blending into a comforting hum. As I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone, something caught my eye. A man, elderly and fragile, dressed in a suit so worn it seemed to carry the weight of decades. His face was unforgettable, lined with stories of struggle and pain. There was a heaviness in his expression that struck me in a way I couldn't quite explain. As the man approached the counter, it was clear he didn't belong in a place like this. Or at least, that's what the waiter's behavior seemed to scream. The waiter looked at him with disdain, as though his presence alone was an offense. The man, Mr. Joseph Smith as I would later learn, humbly requested a simple coffee and a sandwich. But instead of kindness, he was met with hostility. The waiter's words cut through the air, implying that a man like him, dressed in tattered clothing, couldn't possibly afford to eat there. The scene felt so wrong, like watching something sacred being torn apart in broad daylight. Mr. Smith's voice trembled as he insisted he was hungry and needed just a little food. You could feel the vulnerability in his words. But the waiter wasn't moved. His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of other customers who began whispering among themselves. And then, the moment that broke my heart, Mr. Smith reached into his pocket, pulling out a few coins. They clinked on the counter as he laid them out, his hand shaking ever so slightly. His head was lowered, but his dignity shone through. He didn't ask for pity. He only wanted a chance to be treated like any other person. For a moment, the entire café seemed to freeze. Customers exchanged looks, some with discomfort, others with amusement, but no one stepped forward. It was as if compassion had taken a backseat in this grand, bustling city. I sat there, feeling the weight of the moment. My chest tightened and my mind raced. How could people just watch this happen? And yet I hadn't moved either. Until that exact moment, when something inside me screamed, "Linda, do something." I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Every eye in the room seemed to follow me as I made my way to the counter. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. As I walked, I thought about how often people like Mr. Smith are ignored, their vulnerability overlooked. But not today, not if I had anything to do with it. What happened next changed more than just his life. It transformed mine in ways I could never have imagined. As I approached the counter, I could feel the weight of the room on me, but I didn't care. Compassion demanded action, and I couldn't stay silent. The elderly man, Mr. Smith, stood there, his coins scattered on the counter like broken pieces of hope. The waiter, who had clearly decided Mr. Smith wasn't worth his time, looked at me with a mix of confusion and irritation. But I didn't falter. "Please," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "Bring him exactly what he asked for. A coffee and a sandwich. I'll take care of it." The waiter hesitated, clearly weighing whether to argue or comply. I could see his pride battling with the reality of my presence. Maybe it was my tailored suit or the confidence in my tone, but something made him back down. Without another word, he turned toward the kitchen to fulfill the order. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing just slightly. I turned to Mr. Smith, who looked up at me with eyes that spoke of gratitude, surprise, and a lifetime of pain. "You didn't have to," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I shook my head. "Yes, I did," I replied. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." As we stood there side by side, I couldn't help but notice how small he seemed, not just in stature, but in how he carried himself. Vulnerability clung to him like a second skin, and it was impossible not to feel inspired by his quiet strength. I knew this wasn't just about a sandwich or a cup of coffee. It was about showing him, and everyone watching, that no one should be dismissed so easily. This was about more than charity. It was about restoring a piece of his humanity. The waiter returned, placing the food on the counter with a reluctant thud. "Here," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. I thanked him, but my focus remained on Mr. Smith. "Let's find a seat," I said, gesturing to a quiet corner of the cafe. He hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for permission. I gave him a reassuring nod, and slowly he followed me. As we walked, I could feel the stares of the other customers. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the man beside me. When we sat down, he seemed unsure of what to do next. His hands hovered awkwardly over the coffee cup, and his eyes darted around nervously. "It's okay," I said gently. "Take your time." I could see him relax just a little. He took a sip of the coffee, his trembling hands steadying for the briefest moment. It was such a small act, but it felt monumental. I couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this point. What kind of life he must have lived to end up here, being humiliated over a simple meal. As he began to eat, I leaned back, watching him carefully. The vulnerability he carried wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. And yet, there was something about him that intrigued me. A quiet resilience that seemed to defy the situation he was in. "What's your name?" I asked, breaking the silence. He looked up, surprised by the question. "Joseph," he said after a pause. "Joseph Smith." His voice was low, almost as if he were afraid of taking up too much space. Smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Joseph." That simple exchange felt like the beginning of something, though I didn't know what yet. There was a story in his eyes, a depth that begged to be understood. And even though I didn't realize it at the time, this conversation would change everything. For him, for me, and for the piece of my heart I didn't know was missing. As Joseph took another sip of his coffee, I could see a subtle shift in his demeanor. The tension in his shoulders softened, and the lines on his face seemed just a little less harsh. I decided to break the silence with a question that had been on my mind since I stepped in to help him. "Mr. Smith," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Why didn't you walk away when that waiter humiliated you?" He set his cup down, his eyes meeting mine for the first time with a clarity that startled me. "Because," he said slowly, "when you've been hungry for as long as I have, you stop caring what people think." His answer hit me like a tidal wave. The vulnerability in his voice, combined with the quiet strength in his gaze, made it impossible to look away. This wasn't just a man who had suffered. This was someone who had lived through experiences most of us couldn't begin to imagine. I leaned forward, feeling a strange urgency to understand more. "Mr. Smith," I asked softly, "is there anything I can do to help you?" He smiled, a small, weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've already done more than most would," he replied, his voice tinged with gratitude. But I couldn't stop there. Something inside me needed to know more about this man, about his story. So I took a chance. "May I ask you something?" I said, hesitating only slightly. He nodded, his expression guarded but open enough for me to continue. "Do you ever feel like there's something missing in your life? Something you've never quite been able to find?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked, his gaze dropping to his hands. "That's a heavy question," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, looking back at me, he asked, "And what about you, Ms. Jones? Is there something missing in your life for you to feel complete?" The question hung in the air like a delicate thread, fragile yet powerful. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. My life, by all outward appearances, was perfect. I had wealth, success, and a level of independence most people could only dream of. And yet, there was a void, a space in my heart that had never been filled. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "There is." I paused, swallowing the lump that had formed in my throat. When I was 5 years old, I lost my father. I don't know if he died or simply left, but he disappeared from my life without a trace. And ever since, there's been this hole inside me. I've looked for him everywhere, but I've never found a single clue. And now, I stopped, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. Joseph's face softened. His eyes filled with an empathy that felt almost tangible. "And now," he prompted gently, his voice steady and encouraging. I took a deep breath, willing myself to continue. "And now I've given up," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I've exhausted every avenue, every resource. I've reached the end of my search, and I have nothing left to give." Saying those words out loud felt like tearing open an old wound, but at the same time, it felt oddly liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding the pain I'd carried with me for so long. Joseph reached across the table, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on mine. His touch was warm, grounding me in the present moment. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." There was a sincerity in his words that made my chest ache. And then, just as I thought our conversation might end there, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "But Ms. Jones, maybe your father never wanted to leave." I stared at him, my mind reeling. There was something in his tone, something unspoken, that hinted at a depth of understanding I couldn't yet grasp. And in that moment, I realized there was so much more to Joseph Smith than met the eye. Joseph's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I could feel my pulse quicken as I waited for him to explain, but he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "You see," he began, his voice tinged with a quiet sorrow, "there was a time when I had everything, a wife I adored, a daughter who was my world. But life," he paused, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "Life has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it." I leaned forward, my breath caught in my chest. "What happened?" I asked gently, afraid to push too hard but unable to contain my curiosity. Joseph took a deep breath, his eyes distant, as though he were looking at a memory only he could see. "I worked for the government," he said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "A secret project, dangerous, the kind of thing you don't talk about, not even to your family." He glanced at me, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. "When my work put them in danger, I had no choice. I had to leave." The vulnerability in his voice was undeniable, and it struck a chord deep within me. "You left to protect them?" I asked, my own voice barely above a whisper. Joseph nodded, his jaw tightening. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought maybe one day I'd go back, explain everything, and we'd pick up where we left off. But that day never came." His eyes filled with a sadness so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "They told me I couldn't. Too many threats, too many enemies who'd use them to get to me. And then I lost everything." He paused, swallowing hard, as though the memories were too much to bear. "I was sent to Alaska," he continued, his voice quieter now. "A safe house, they called it. But it was more like a prison. Isolated, cold, cut off from the world. I spent years there, alone, wondering if they were safe, if they hated me, if they even remembered me." His words painted a picture of unimaginable loneliness, of a life defined by sacrifice and regret. It was an emotional story unlike anything I had ever heard. I felt tears sting my eyes as I listened, my heart breaking for this man who had given up everything for a duty that had left him with nothing. "Joseph," I said softly, my voice trembling, "did you ever try to reach out to them?" He shook his head, his expression one of quiet resignation. "I couldn't. Not without putting them in danger. And by the time it was safe, it was too late. They were gone. I didn't even know where to start looking." His vulnerability was palpable, and for a moment, I felt as though the weight of his pain was pressing down on me too. "Do you regret it?" I asked, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. Joseph hesitated, his eyes meeting mine with a depth of emotion that took my breath away. "Every day," he admitted, his voice raw. "But what choice did I have? What kind of man would I have been if I stayed and put their lives at risk?" His words lingered in the air, a testament to the sacrifices he had made and the humanity he still carried despite everything he had endured. "I've lived with this emptiness for so long," he said quietly, "that I don't even know what it feels like to be whole anymore." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, and I realized that in his pain, there was a reflection of my own. Neither of us had expected the connection that was forming between us, and neither of us could have predicted what would come next. As Joseph finished speaking, his words seemed to linger in the air, heavy and unspoken. I found myself overwhelmed by the depth of his vulnerability and the undeniable inspiration his story carried. His sacrifice, his endurance, it was almost too much to comprehend. I reached out instinctively, placing my hand gently over his, as if to offer some fragment of comfort. That's when I noticed it. A faint mark just below the edge of his sleeve, peeking out as his hand shifted slightly. My breath caught in my throat. "Joseph," I began, my voice barely audible. "That mark on your wrist. Is it a birthmark?" He froze, his eyes widening in surprise. Slowly, he pulled back his sleeve to reveal the full mark. A small, crescent-shaped birthmark I had seen only once before, in an old photograph tucked away in a drawer filled with memories of a father I had never truly known. My heart began to race, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over me like a tidal wave. "Yes," he said cautiously, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why do you ask?" I could barely find my voice as I stared at him, the pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to align. "Joseph," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. "That birthmark. My father had the same one. It's identical." His expression changed in an instant, confusion giving way to something deeper, something unspoken. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Your father," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 unspoken truths passed between us. I felt tears welling in my eyes as I fought to keep my composure. "Joseph," I said again, my voice breaking. "Is it possible? Could you be my father?" The words felt surreal, as though they belonged to someone else. But as I said them, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a flicker that turned into a spark, then a flame. "Linda," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Linda. Is it really you?" I nodded, unable to speak as the weight of the moment pressed down on both of us. He reached out then, his hands trembling as they cupped mine. "I thought I'd lost you forever," he said, his voice breaking with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "I've dreamed of this moment for so many years, but I never thought it would come true." Tears streamed down my face as I gripped his hands tightly, afraid that if I let go, the moment would disappear like a dream. "It's me," I said softly, my voice shaking. "It's really me." The cafe around us seemed to fade into the background as we sat there, two souls reconnected by a twist of fate neither of us could have anticipated. "All these years," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I've thought of you every day. I've wondered what kind of person you became, if you were safe, if you were happy. And now here you are." His words cut through me like a knife, a mix of pain and relief that I couldn't begin to process. I looked at him then, really looked at him, the lines on his face, the sadness in his eyes, the weight he carried. And I saw not just the man before me, but the father I had lost so long ago. "You're here now," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. "That's all that matters. You're here, and we found each other." We sat there for what felt like an eternity, holding on to each other as though the world could crumble around us and it wouldn't matter. And in that moment, I realized that the emptiness I had carried with me for so long was beginning to fade. It wasn't gone, not yet, but for the first time in years I felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. For the first time in years, I felt like my heart had found a piece of itself that had been missing for so long. Sitting across from my father, Joseph, I realized that life had a strange way of bringing us back to what truly matters. The cafe, once filled with judgmental whispers and disapproving stares, seemed to fade into irrelevance. All that mattered was this moment, the reunion I had given up on, the one I never thought possible. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had endured so much, who had sacrificed everything. And yet, here he was, holding on to me as if he'd never let go again. "Linda," he said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and remorse. "I don't know how to make up for the years we've lost. I don't even know where to begin." His words carried the weight of decades, but there was something else too, hope. I reached for his hands again, gripping them tightly, as though to remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "One day at a time. We can't change the past, but we can make the most of the time we have now." The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored my own, and for the first time in years I felt inspired, like the pieces of my life that never quite fit were finally coming together. He nodded slowly, his face softening as he wiped at his own tears. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, I don't deserve a second chance." But I shook my head, my grip on his hands tightening. "You deserve this, Dad," I said firmly, the word feeling both foreign and natural on my tongue. "We both do." As the minutes turned into hours, we talked about everything and nothing all at once. He told me about his years in Alaska, the loneliness, the cold, the moments of doubt that threatened to swallow him whole. And I told him about my life, the successes I thought would fill the void, the endless search for something I couldn't name. We laughed, we cried, and for the first time we began to bridge the gap that had kept us apart for so long. When the cafe began to close, I realized that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to say, so many memories to create. As we walked outside, the city lights casting a soft glow on the streets, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "Where are you staying?" I asked, suddenly worried about what his answer might be. He hesitated, and in that pause I saw the truth. "I don't really have a place," he admitted quietly, his vulnerability breaking my heart all over again. I stopped in my tracks, my decision already made. "Then you'll come with me," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at me surprised, but I could see the gratitude in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling. I smiled, reaching out to touch his arm. "Course I am. You're my family, and family takes care of each other." His expression softened, and for the first time that day, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. As we walked together side by side, I felt the weight of the years begin to lift. This wasn't just the end of a long and painful search, it was the beginning of something new, something neither of us could have anticipated. Life, as unpredictable and cruel as it could be, had given us this chance, and for that I was endlessly grateful.
What would you do if you were in Linda's shoes? Would you have the courage to step in, or the patience to listen to a stranger's heartbreaking story? Stories like this remind us of the power of compassion, the depth of human vulnerability, and how one small act can lead to something extraordinary. It's incredible to think that a simple moment in a cafe could reveal a truth that changed lives forever. Now, I want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts. And if this story moved you as much as it moved me, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story like this one. Your next life-changing moment could be just one click away.